The topic that we are discussing today, of course, is the liberal conundrum. Whose democracy is it anyways? And why do we keep talking about democracy in danger every now and then? Why do we talk about it, Sanjeev, Sanyal?
So I think the first thing to remember is that liberal democracy used to be about whether or not elections were held regularly, whether the system was open, and so on and so forth. What it's come to mean, unfortunately, for many people is that a liberal democracy is a democracy where self-certified liberals win. And unfortunately, that definition doesn't cut ice with people who obviously disagree with that line of thought. So just like today was the day where the ruling dispensation in Delhi won these three state elections, it is also the day that a Swedish think tank called VDEM, reasonably well-known think tank, comes up with a democracy report in which India, which is by some margin the world's largest democracy, is rated 108 out of 140 countries. Now, my friend here from Hungary is smirking, but he is 96. And just so that you know, we are about three places up from Pakistan. Now, the even better bit of it is that the same report, this is today's report, right? So it has in it, a list of countries, very few, very small, short list of countries where democracy has improved according to them over the last decade. And I was quite curious. I thought one of the countries there is a neighbor, Sri Lanka. Oh. Now, after what happened last year there, I'm just shocked that they consider Sri Lanka as an electoral success. So what has basically happened here is that there has been a complete breakdown of these ideas into self-serving ideologies, which have nothing to do with actually the original idea of liberal democracy. And this is rather serious because what is happening now is that these labels are now increasingly being used as political point-scoring tools. Of course, at one level, they may happen from think tanks and so on. But we do know that there are large pots of money, such, for example, Soros's Open Society Foundation, for example, which blatantly goes around spending money for creating certain kinds of narratives. And I think those things need to be called out. Yes. Again, by the way, from my friend's country.
Yes, and I'll just give one more perspective in this victory. Of the 3 states that have been won, 2 states have a high percentage, almost 60 to 70% of Christians and tribals. So they have a high minority population and they have voted for the BJP.
Other state, the other one is, although Hindu, 35% tribal population, very often said not to be also another form of a minority.
Yes. So the point that I'm trying to make is when we look at a functioning democracy such as India, how fair is it to say that democracy is in danger? And that is something that we hear every now and then. Who defines a democracy? Should it be for the people, by the people, and of the people? Or should it be for the elite, by the elite, and of the elite? And we happen to sit in Lutyens, Delhi. And as a journalist who has traveled far and wide, I've traveled to each and every state of India, gone to, those alleys which were completely different before 2014 and has changed post that. So we have seen democracy function, and I'm an eyewitness, I would say, to that, Sanjeev. And let me take that question and ask Mr. Orban, whose democracy is threatened?
Well, good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much. We are just jumped in the middle of this conversation, which I enjoy very much. This is the first moment when an Indian and a Hungarian is 100% on the same side. It's probably not the last moment. I'm sure we both fought on the Mongols, and we have some...
And came off second best.
And right now we have both fighting against George Soros and his liberal organization. So there are some similarities, but I think democracy has to be taken seriously, because from a political philosophical point of view, without the consent and the agreement of the people, there is no good governance, and it's not an important principle since the Greeks invented the idea of democracy, but it's since we have the mankind, it's the basic pillar of good governance. You have to govern with the will of the people and with the support of the people. Without the support of the people, you cannot be successful. It doesn't matter how good intentions you have. And what we see, at least in Hungary, that India, what is going on in this country, it's really this country is a positive example. It's a rising star. It's an emerging big power. And Mr. Modi and his government is taking the lead with the consent of the people. So from our perspective, it's obvious that what we should do is not to criticize them, but to give a big applause to them for the achievements. The Hungarian perspective, it's very obvious. Right now in Europe, if you are not in favor of mass migration, if you are not in favor of gender propaganda, if you are not in favor of building European superstate, if you are not in favor of continuation of the war, but rather you would like to talk about the peace, then you are not a good Democrat.
Are you a liberal then?
Please?
Are you a liberal?
No, the opposite. So this is problematic because it makes impossible real conversation, which is always very important in a democratic society. You need to have alternatives. We need to discuss whether same-sex marriage is acceptable or not. Some people are saying that it shouldn't be part of the constitutional structure. Some people are saying that they should be. We should have an open debate on that. At the end of this debate, this question should be decided by the majority of the people. This is how democracy starts. And if somebody is saying that according to the liberal principles, this question should go into that specific direction because the other direction goes into an autocracy, then open discussion and freedom of speech is gone. So we should defend democracy, but from this point of view, not the point of view what is discussed by the liberal politicians and think tank people.
Mr. Carafano, just take that thought I had, particularly in the context of do liberals threaten democracy or do they get threatened by democracy?
Yeah, so, and obviously I'd be happy to talk about American politics in particular if you want to ask that in a follow-up. But as somebody who spends a lot of time going around the world, talking to a lot of politicians in a lot of different systems, I want to go back first and echo something that was said in the debate, because the number one problem we have in the world with this debate is we tend to mirror image this debate. So when we hear a narrative, we tend to see in other people's politics what we're seeing in our politics. And I think the one thing that we have to understand is you cannot understand a country's politics unless you actually understand their politics. My new best friend is from Nigeria. I just got a tutorial on Nigerian politics. And that, let me tell you, my friends, is a different kind of democracy. So I want to tell you a very quick story. I swear it's really quick. So I was talking to this ambassador. I won't tell you which country in Europe. It wouldn't be fair. So I was talking to the Belgian ambassador, and he asked me, he goes, why are Republicans racist? Which is the question you always want to hear, right? And I was like, excuse me? He goes, why are Republicans, why don't they want to let black people vote? And I was really confused. he goes, well, in America, you have all these Jim Crow laws that you prevent people from voting. And he goes, why do Republicans support that? And I said, well, because this was in the news, I said, well, what you're actually talking about there was a bill that somebody proposed that in the state, that in order to vote, you would have to produce a valid identity credential before you voted. And he just kind of paused and he looked at me and he goes, well, who doesn't do that? You know, in Belgium, you have to have an identity card to vote. Like, that's stupid. I mean, and so what he had done is he had just absorbed this popular narrative and never actually took a second to actually look and see what the actual debate about. The second thing I want to make, do you think about liberals is, and this is why India is very important, and it's part of this thing is, there's a big difference between countries that have a federal system and countries that don't, particularly when we look at democratic process. So a country like India and the United States, for example, we have a deeply federal system that provides another layer of releasing steam. And democracies operate different in those things, and they're much, much more vibrant. So so that makes a big difference. And the third thing I'll say is, with all these democracies under threat, right, and this is horrible, let's use Europe for example. Look at the number of center-right governments that we have in Europe, in particular, right now, that have weathered politics that are some of the worst in modern times. High inflation, crazy energy prices, a war, and yet those are some of the most stable governments elected with some of the strongest margins. Look at what Meloni just did in Italy, which is an unbelievable political achievement. And look, we like to call him the other Orban for people who don't follow. But, you know, and we have, we have great discussions, and I have lots of issues with different policies that Hungary has, but this is a country that elected a leader over and over again by overwhelming majorities. That they said, this is the person that we want to lead our country, and we believe in his vision. And somehow, that's a threat to democracy. I mean, at some level, this whole argument just gets a bit stupid.
But the systems aren't opaque, Velina. You know, there are, as you were talking, we were discussing, there are multiple pillars to how you describe a liberal and you describe the conundrum of a liberal. If we were to look at it, whose democratic rights are the liberals fighting for?
I don't think that I'm in a position to answer this question, since I'm not this kind of political scientist that is dealing with these kind of questions. And when I don't have an expertise on a certain issue, I just simply admit it. Now, allow me to take a helicopter view on the question, on the general question that we are dealing with today, from the perspective of a geopolitical analyst. Once again, I am dealing actually with interests and goals of states that are engaged very often in a conflict, competition, and sometimes, if necessary, collaboration. And here I see that this kind of liberal conundrum is going to play a role once again. Why? Because I'm already observing, and if you remember from last year at the beginning of the Olympics and prior to the beginning of the Olympic Games in China, that we had this big moment of Western boycotting of the Olympic Games and then the emergence of an alliance of democracies. And here I'm very, very cautious that if we are approaching towards a Cold War 2.0 scenario, we are about to see that, nobody can tell us. But in case, and let's assume for a moment that we are in this kind of scenario, I don't think that this time it's going to be the same ideological competition as it was the case during the Cold War, namely this big ideological competition between the liberal democracies on the one hand, with the capitalist system and with the whole human rights agenda, fighting the second communist superpower. And it's even, actually, I argue, dangerous to turn this debate into this kind of confrontation because, yes, on the one hand, we see this kind of growing modus vivendi of coordination on behalf of China and Russia to create a counter-narrative to the predominant one, namely to show the world that there can be another model of governance, and it is successful, and it works, and it actually creates predictability and stability at home, but also in the relations with third countries. But at the very same time, if the democratic world tries to pursue itself and third countries, that they are now practically the oasis of, the liberal world order, the rest of the liberal order, let's say, in an emerging new Cold War. It is dangerous in a sense because there will be actually third countries that do not share this model of governance, and yet they are not siding with the dragon bear. And they should actually have a space where their hearts and minds can be also won over actually the lack of ideological competition.
So you're linking the ideological competition with the model of governance.
Exactly.
I disagree slightly. I don't think, I'd agree on the ideological competition bit, but I disagree with the idea that Russia and China and their models of government provide the predictability and stability that global capital or global business really need, because that predictability comes with catastrophic, almost near catastrophic levels of risk should things ever go wrong. And the problem with closed societies, opaque societies like this, is that you can never quite tell what it is that's going to go wrong. And I think if we loop back to the premise of the question itself, on whether there is such a moment of democratic crisis, I mean, I want to believe that part of it's just, just the Tocqueville effect, that the more open our societies are, the more you can see potential problems. And just because you can see them doesn't mean that they were never there. As far as India is concerned, I mean, Indian democracy has supposedly been on the cusp of collapse for 75 years. We're literally supposed to be one step away from disaster right from 1947. And clearly, if we've managed for 75 years, we're doing something right.
The democratization of free speech that has happened, particularly post the social media and digital space, it has given voice to the voiceless. But it is about representation of that voiceless, right? Mr. Sanyal, when we look at it from that perspective, who defines a voiceless? In the sense that when you have representatives sitting here in New Delhi, in positions of power, they are actually from those among the voiceless. But if their arguments are not making several people comfortable, then should they be seen as the real representatives?
So it depends what you mean by this. Very often this term is used by what I should call the activist types, who then claim to be the representatives
of the subaltern.
Proclaim themselves as the representatives of the voiceless. So this is a very clever way of essentially giving themselves importance when they are unable to get themselves into parliament or get votes, or other democratic ways of becoming representative people. Basically say those people are voiceless, hence we represent them. But there is, however, in this new world, genuine areas where voicelessness can happen. But it'll happen in a much more insidious way. One of them is what was going on, now we know for sure, in Twitter, before the somewhat chaotic way it was opened up. But the fact is that many of the things many of us suspected, i.e. shadow banning, deliberately skewing the way things are spread. For example, even in the very important issue of whether or not the virus came from a Wuhan lab. Now, even the US government, FBI, etc., has agreed that this was a lab leak in Wuhan, China. However, for a fair period of time, these large social media groups essentially would warn you or block off information if you took that view. Similar kinds of views happened with, for example, even with skepticism over vaccines, right? I personally took the vaccine. I'm not a vaccine skeptic. But since this discussion is about freedom of speech and voicelessness, let's say that it is, skepticism about vaccines should be allowed, even if you think it's wrong or... So I think this is the real issue. And I think the problem here is that certain kinds of debate are being shut down, ironically by people who proclaim themselves to be liberal, when you would think that one of the first tenets of liberalism has got to be free speech.
Yes, but Mr. Orban, staying with social media and its role, because social media is under a lot of scrutiny. Uh, if you have a free speech, which in many ways leads to bringing the fault lines on the surface, what is the role of that free speech?
May I come back to the original question about liberal democracy, but I will arrive to your point as well. Because I think about liberal democracy, there is a simple misunderstanding between the West and the rest of the world, and the rest is included the post-Soviet European arena as well. Because after the Second World War, for Western European countries and for United States and Northern American countries, liberal democracy based on free speech, constitutional order, respect human rights, free election, this is what liberal democracy meant. And under this political regime, they became extremely successful. The United States won the Cold War. Western European countries were rising. And but when the Cold War ended, and then the liberal democracy was started to spread all over the world, then for the developing countries, and for my country as well, and for my region as well, this kind of liberal democracy was about losing our sovereignty and experiencing political freedom on one hand, but on the other hand, economic downside. So for a Hungarian or for a Czech, for a Slovakian, if you talk about liberal democracy, it means economic downside. If you talk about liberal democracy for a Belgian or for a French, then it's an era of economic prosperity. And I wouldn't undermine this aspect of liberal democracy, because in politics you have to create economic success. You have to bring economic success. Otherwise, these ideological debates are not important. For everyday grassroots people, economy is more important. You have to be successful, and that's a proof for your political structure as well. And what happened after the transition period, at least I think after the Cold War, is that liberals, progressives, they occupied some territories, not in politics and not in economy, because economically their method was not very successful, but in culture, media, academia, think tank world. And actually what we experience today in the United States, in Europe, and in some other places as well, that these era of culture, in a broad term, including media and social media, is dominated by one political view, which goes against the idea of open debates, open, rational, reasonable debates of all the issues and all the challenges we are facing. But honestly, as I'm coming from a country with 10 million people without any single national social media platform, we are also using the social media platforms which are provided by big countries, mainly by the United States, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. These fights should be fought there in their big countries. So they have the right, they have the power to create a free opportunity for everybody in that countries. And if it happens, then it will help for the smaller countries in Europe and in the rest of the world. So that's why I'm very happy to see that this kind of culture of war at least started in the United States.
Can I just add to that? Because you've actually bridged two related but different issues. One is election integrity and the validity of election. And the other is free speech, which also plays a role in the election. But they are somewhat different. And I think one of the challenges is there are countries that have a legitimate challenge of democracy because the actual functioning of the democratic process has been threatened, right? And I think those are legitimate issues of discussion, and nothing will destroy a democracy faster than the loss of the legitimacy of an election. I think that's fair. But now what we've done is we've shifted that debate for let's talk about the mechanics of whether we're doing this thing right to talking about the legitimacy of speech and what you can criticize. And so in many ways, the debates over election integrity, voter suppression, validity of elections, what people can say, is really become kind of a bellwether issue for this larger thing, which is what is legitimate speech, right? And what is permissible speech? So somehow we've created this notion, and we've used elections as part of this to say, no, free speech is a threat to democracy because it threatens the process that we have established. And I think that's really, really dangerous. I mean, I do thought experiments and say, show me a country in the world, a free country, a free democracy, that has been brought down and destroyed by free speech. I'm really hard-pressed to think of one. And even today, for example, if you think in Europe, where you see, for example, still massive Russian propaganda efforts in Western Europe to convince people that, you know, this is bad, Ukrainians are bad, they're all Nazis and everything else, the Ukrainians have actually launched a very credible counter-social media campaign, and people in their own countries, and it hasn't changed how those countries feel. So evidently, they can survive with free speech in a very, very difficult environment with high inflation, bad energy prices, a war on their doorstep, and somehow people can still make decisions and decide for themselves. So I think these are both really important issues, but in some way there are two different issues. And what shouldn't be lost is the debate about people trying to change the system to rig the outcomes. And this notion of this bigger narrative, which is taking weaponizing speech and taking it off the table in order to favor your political outcome.
I also want to understand from you, Mr. Carafano, particularly in the context of the elections are seen, and particularly in a big democracy such as ours, and we have been having a functional democracy for all 75 years, that's the biggest validation of a government's economic policies and policies of various nature. Will that be a fair assessment to say? Because if you win election one after the other, and if it happens through legitimate processes, then it's the right way that the people at large are endorsing your policies.
Well, we actually have lots of examples in America that actually demonstrate that's not true. So we have a deeply federal system, which means there's a lot of power devolved onto states. And then, in turn, there's a lot of power devolved onto local governments and cities. And we actually have cities that are literally horror shows, that have high crime rates, have terrible employment rates, have huge homeless problems, have failing schools year in and year out, and yet the same governments keep getting elected over and over and over again. And it's actually not about vote rigging and everything else. It's because people choose to vote the machine back. So we just had this case in Chicago, this stunning situation where people are shocked that the mayor was voted out, having one of the most disastrous records as a mayor in modern history, and yet getting elected again and again and again. And then people were actually shocked she was voted out. So I actually disagree with you. I mean, you can have really, really bad outcomes and win elections.
Sanjeev, would you come in on this? And then I'll bring in Velina.
I mean, see, the point of the matter is democracies don't always give you the best of outcomes, and it can repeatedly give you bad outcomes. I happen, by the way, my native state is the state of West Bengal. I'm Bengali. I grew up in a state which was ruled by a communist party and a chief minister who, even when I was growing up in the 80s, was clearly a disaster, a chap called Jyoti Basu. And yet, he was, till very recently, he was bypassed by Naveen Patnaik, but he was, for a very long time, the longest ruling chief minister of any state in India. Even though everybody agrees, and even at that time agreed, that he was a disaster. He destroyed the economy of the state, he destroyed Kolkata as a city, and so on and so forth. So, yes, democracy, as I think it was Churchill who said this, and one of the few things I agree with him on, it's the worst system, but for everything else. I can't remember the exact quote, but he said something in those. Yeah, Churchill said something in those lines. But basically, the point is that it's not a perfect system, but it does allow for peaceful transition of power if and when the people get sick of it, and don't have to raid the presidential palace and burn it down or whatever else happens. So it's not a perfect system. Sometimes you will you will get repeated good elections and you genuinely are bringing good quality people back. But the dynamics of a system can also perpetuate poor quality people for long periods of time as well.
Is that also because of first past the post?
Maybe it's because of first past the post, but I mean, it's not. There are other countries, many countries in Europe with other forms of, with very dysfunctional polities. So it's not entirely clear that it's just first past the post. At the very least, what first past the post does is makes it easier to arrive at clear majorities. And the alternative systems, proportional representation and so on, will give you much messier outcomes.
Elena, you want?
Yeah, I would like to take over from here because I think that one of the major points that was, I think, made by all my co-speakers is the point that in democratic societies, now no matter the exact form of governance, in the end, it is a messy process, but it is a process in which, you know, everyone is dealing with everyone. We have so many different players, so many agency. And it is an open system, so that also means that we are observing the process from outside and from within. Whereas we very often think that authoritarian, for instance, closed systems are not having problems. It's just that because they're not openly discussing these problems with their society, it does not mean that they don't have these problems. And also think of the situation that when you are a closed system, and you have a very, very small, leadership core at, the heart of, of the political elite dealing with all the problems. In a very vertical kind of leadership, you are not adaptive. You're not reflecting on, all of these changes that are happening in society, in all of the relevant networks and systems. And we've seen plenty of examples that are actually proving the case. I mean, think of the implosion of the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was not actually won over as a superpower. It was not militarily defeated. It imploded because the system became so inefficient, also to the point that society did not need to reflect on anything happening there. It was a resignation par excellence. We had elections in the Soviet bloc with 126% voting, that kind of absurdities. So in a sense, what I'm trying to say in the end is, and we are observing this kind of criticism on a daily basis because we are open systems, we are messy, we are not perfect, but we're trying to figure out things, whereas those systems that are like, trying to present themselves as these perfectly functioning machines, the things are happening, but they're happening below the surface.
Can I just add one point, just super quick? Because a lot of this is the threat to democracy is an election outcome that we don't like. But
Yes.
but a lot of what is going on in the world today, in many cases, not in cases like my friend in Nigeria who has a collapsed election system, but in many places, it's not a threat to democracy, it's a change in that democracy. And so for the United States, for example, we have hyperpartisanship. That's because our two major political parties are much more homogeneous and have much less common ground. That's not a threat to democracy. It's a change in the character of our political parties. And on this, I get back to the basic point is, you have to look into that country and see what's going on in their election system and understand why. Why did people finally vote out Lori Lightfoot in Chicago after all these years? And say it's not necessarily because the system is evil, but something's going on in that democracy that you need to pay attention to.
Will you respond so that I'll open the floor for questions?
No, I actually have to agree. The dissatisfaction with democratic outcomes doesn't necessarily mean a kind of question mark over the entire democratic process. I just had a quick point about liberalism. I think one of the reasons that liberalism gets a bad rep and has a bit of a bad reputation, especially in the post-colonial world, is that its history is inextricably tied to imperialism and colonialism. Ultimately, liberalism has makes universalist claims. It's global in its orientation, and it provided the justification for empire for so many hundred years. The idea was that we were, we couldn't be ruled by ourselves because we didn't know how to. We weren't liberal enough. We needed to be socialized into liberalism. That's what the justification for empire was. And empire was, for the longest time, a liberal enterprise, as Sanjeev has written about and knows very well. And its opposite, conservatism, by its very nature, is very kind of grounded in culture and grounded in local society. And so I think when we raise the question about what it is that led to such a huge blowback against liberalism, there's also the question of historical memory, that when it rides on the back of globalization, it evokes a certain kind of historical memory in the rest of the world, which is not good.
Are the liberals then dehyphenating themselves?
They're not dehyphenating themselves. They're just by its very nature, it makes universalist claims. It makes the claim that someone sitting in Nigeria and someone sitting in India and someone sitting in another part of the world have similar interests, similar orientations, and similar demands from their political system, which, in my eyes, is not true.
I'll open the floor for questions. Please go ahead, right there. Can the mic be passed, please?
Thank you. Question for Mr. Orban. You referred to something called gender propaganda in your remarks. I wanted to ask you what you meant by that. Thank you.
Gender propaganda.
Can you elaborate on the point about gender propaganda that you were?
Okay. So, yes, so the question what the Western world is facing is the following. Right now, our children in schools get some enlightenment from mainly from NGOs, from some media people, and but also from some teachers about what they should think about their sexuality and what they should think about their gender, how many genders are there, so they get this kind of enlightenment through the educational network. And I think it's problematic because it shouldn't be decided by the state, it shouldn't be decided by the schools, it shouldn't be decided by anybody else, just the family. So as a father, I want to know what kind of sexual orientation my children get in school. And if I don't know anything about it and I cannot give my consent to that, I think this is problematic. So I want to have my control. And this is a kind of debate, what is going on in the United States and what in the western part of the world, that liberal, progressive, gender activists are occupying some fields of education, and conservative governments from all over the western part, like Governor DeSantis in Florida, like my prime minister in Hungary, like the government in Poland, they want to fight back, which is about regaining the right of parents to have control on children's education. Adults can do whatever they want. It's a free society. It's not part of the discussion, but we need to be able to protect our children.
Yes, please.
Hi, this question, or two-part question, is for James and Sanjeev. Can you talk a bit about the difference between hate speech and just speech, talking about
Sorry, we
freedom of
can't hear you.
Sorry, I'm hoping, Sanjeev and James, you can speak about hate speech versus just any kind of speech in a democracy. And speaking of freedom of speech, what do you have to say about freedom of the press? And what is the responsibility of a democratic leader in a non-Eurocentric, well-functioning democracy to grant full and equal access to the press to make sure that everyone, not just their voters, can hear from the leader? Thank you.
I'll address the free speech real quick, and then everybody else can jump on the other ones. I think one of the hallmarks of conservative philosophy, which I think some of us share, is this notion of rule of law, that there is an established rule of law that is equally applied to everybody, and that's one of the foundationals of a successful liberal democracy. And therefore, I am uncomfortable with terms like hate speech because, well, under the rule of law, there's a clear definition of speech which is injurious under the law, right? So if I am publicly advocating overthrowing the government, that's insurrection. If the famous yelling fire at a crowded theater, if you're telling somebody go out and kill Vilda, no, that anyway I'm saying. But I mean these are speeches which are classified as illegal because under a law where everybody is treated equally, these are injurious acts, right? As injurious as a physical crime, of murder or something else. When you start to have other classifications of speech which are permissible or not permissible, I find that very problematic. And I think that's what's actually gotten us to this weaponization of the concept of free speech that we are today, which is the liberal concept of let's just make everything perfect. So, illegal speech was okay, but it's not as good as getting rid of hate speech. Okay, so now we've gotten rid of hate speech, but that's not as good as getting rid of harmful speech. Okay, so we get rid of, well, now let's get rid of unintentional harmless speech that actually might make me harmed later, right? And so it never ends. So I'm in the camp of being very against kind of broadening the concept of the legality of speech beyond essentially criminal activity.
Yeah. So.
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay. Sorry. So I think I'll go with, I agree with that general point, that there are certain kinds of, and it's well established what those are, which are clearly injurious forms of hate speech, and I think, or injurious kinds of speech. And those, there is already, for quite some time, reasonably well established rules in law and even in society what those are. So is somebody screaming fire in a crowded theater or actually inciting violence towards some particular person, those are clearly things that should not be allowed. Beyond that, I think things should be more or less open. But I think there was also a question about access to the free press. Yes, the press should indeed be free, but it should be genuinely free and allowed open, so what should I say? It should be an open platform for everybody. And so let me show you, since there's been a lot of Russia bashing around. So let me say, on Twitter, you have RT News, right? And it always comes up on Twitter, it says state-affiliated media. Fair enough. But you never see that with BBC. It's also state-affiliated media. Now, somebody will say, yes, but Russia is invading other countries. Now, no country in history over the last 300 years has invaded more other countries than Britain.
Yes.
If there's any media that should be called state-affiliated media and watch out, that's got to be BBC. So I think it has got to be, it has got to be an even, yeah. The French are objecting to what? They want that. No, I have a problem with the French. I have this argument all with the time that they keep getting annoyed that the British left. Why? There are many countries in the world which have a full holiday for celebrating Brexit. So my point is...
In Europe, we are treated as extremists. I'm surprised.
So you got to understand this, that if it has to be open, then it has to be properly open.
I just wanted to draw your attention also to another problematic based on real world experience. I mean, having the possibility to compare the two systems because I lived in both. Well, in the closed system, we had the opposite problem. Everything was forbidden. You could actually not exercise any speech whatsoever. And now what I've been observing in most recent time is that we have some of the tools being introduced, such as truth ministry and trying to somehow limit speech and categorize speech and whatsoever, what has a kind of reminiscence, at least to those who have been living already in this kind of Soviet bloc, that I think is dangerous. And probably the best way how to deal with it is to have an open discussion, open conversation about what tolerant societies actually should agree on not tolerate. Because what is the opposite? In the opposite world, it is a world based on intolerance. You have a constructed reality. And of course, we know for a fact that a small political elite actually has the control over information flow and everything else. So we should deal with the question in open societies, in open systems, what kind of, or let's say, which scale of intolerance we should actually agree to not tolerate, even though that we are based on tolerance. And I think that this is a valid question that we need to address.
What we can certainly take away from this panel is that the fundamental characteristic of democracy is to have these debates. And agreement is not a virtue of democracy. In fact, sometimes celebrating even the disagreements is. And as long as we allow those spaces of disagreements, we will continue to have a structure that is fundamentally tolerant and may disagree on what is intolerant, rather than being fundamentally intolerant and agreeing on what is tolerant. And I think that's the takeaway that I get from this particular Conversations Over Cover. And please join me in applauding the wonderful panel for their time and for their inputs. And let me invite my colleagues to present each one of them a Raisina memento.